Hello, my name is Sean Ward, and this is my project, Influenza Care Plans by State, Month, and Population. So today we're going to be focusing on a number of different aspects. We're going to be focusing on influenza deaths by state and by month, and how many patients each of the states have per provider in terms of staffing, and also which states seem to have higher vulnerable populations. So, with this first slide here, we are looking at which states and which months see the largest spike in influenza deaths. And you look and you see that the top 8 states alone account for over 50% of the influenza deaths between the years of 2009 and 2017. So you can definitely see that these 8 states are a focus point in terms of influenza. And also you look at the most deaths by month, it seems to peak at January, 61,000. So from August to September to October to November to December to January, it increases. And it starts to slowly decrease, but stays at a pretty high level until April. And for the next slide here, we are showing influenza deaths as by population of each state. And I did zoom in on this so that we could see a lot of the states that are outside of the top 10 in terms of influenza deaths. So you see this line here is the average. So everything to the left are states that have a lower death rate as by population, and the states to the right of the line have a higher death rate by population. So we can look at the 6 states that are beyond the top 10 influenza deaths. And there's Massachusetts, which the further you are from the line going to the right, the higher the death rate. So Massachusetts has a problematic death rate. Missouri is another one. Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Hawaii. And to the right here, this is the full listing of all 50 states plus Washington, D.C. in terms of influenza deaths. And we're moving on to the spatial and temporal map here. And this goes from 2009 to 2017. And the shading of each state, the darker the shade, the more the population is. And then you can see all of the circles in each state represent how many influenza deaths they've had by year. So if you go through each of the years, 2009, then 2010, you can see California's shade got a little darker there. And you can see as you're going through the years that there really isn't a huge difference. Texas got a little smaller there. Florida got a little bigger. 2017. But it is interesting to see by map, where exactly the population of the country is and how many deaths comparatively. You can see the circle for New York's way bigger than something, say, South Dakota, which has 425 deaths for 2017. New York, 9,034. And moving on to average patients per provider. Now this is an average throughout 2009 to 2017. And as you can see, the higher the number in terms of average patients per provider, the more understaffed the state is. So we got Washington, D.C. at top, which is 1,379 patients per provider. And then on the bottom, it's New Hampshire. There's only 167 patients per provider. And you look on the chart on the right here, and this shows, in terms of the average by month, it goes through the year here. And you can see that it peaks at August, September, October. So actually, the months with the most patients per provider, meaning the most understaffed months, are August, September, and October, which means there's hasn't been enough preventive measures, because by the end of the year, it actually gets to be much lower in terms of patients per provider for November and December. And moving on to the next chart, which is very similar to the last, except there is this bar in the middle here, which shows pretty much from 90% to 110% of the average. So the average is 410 in terms of patients per provider by state. And we're using this gauge here, 90 to 110%, because everything that's over 110% of the average means that they are understaffed. So states ranked 1 to 13 are understaffed, down to Nevada, from DC to Nevada, and then states between 14 and 20 are properly staffed, since they sit within that 90 to 110% shading. And then everything from 21 on down is actually overstaffed. But as you can see, the most overstaffed state, 167 per provider, when the average is 410, isn't that far as compared to, say, the most understaffed state, DC, and even Colorado is over 1,000 patients per provider, while the average is 410. And moving on to the next one here, and we're moving to vulnerable population by state. Now, vulnerable population is defined as 65 and over and under 5. So, with no surprise there, Florida is on top at 23.63% in terms of percentage of vulnerable population. And you can see the line here that moves all the way down is actually the average for the country, which is 20.22%. And you can see there's not a huge difference, but it is important to look at vulnerable population, because they're called vulnerable because they're most likely to die from influenza, or to be the most affected by it. And so, wrapping it up with these last two slides here, we have the key is to focus on these understaffed states, especially the top 5. So these states are the ones that are understaffed, as according to the patients per provider, and should be the ones that are focused on more in terms of staffing. And also, the second element to focus on, of course, is the states with the highest vulnerable population, which by this chart you can see high need, medium need, low need. So the high need is definitely when you want to get the staffing in quicker than the medium or low need. And then moving on to the last slide here. Now this is showing the top 5 states in terms of how many deaths. And you can see actually Florida has been trending up. They actually surpassed Pennsylvania, and they might be well on their way to surpassing Texas as well. And you can see a number of these states tend to be trending down, like Texas is, and Pennsylvania. And so the top 10 states by influenza deaths definitely require some kind of focus with staffing, since they are the states that that take up more than half of the country's deaths. And then there's also the 6 states beyond the top 10, which I showed you on the previous chart, that shows that they have a high rate of influenza deaths by population: Massachusetts, Missouri, Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Hawaii. And then with states, in terms of months, the 2 biggest spikes in deaths month to month is November to December, which is a huge spike of 11,000, and then December to January, which is a spike of 14,000 deaths. So the month with the most patients per provider is September, as we saw previously: September, October, November, or actually August, September, October. I apologize. And more staffing should begin to be provided in September for a lot of these high need and more vulnerable states. And for the medium need and low need and less vulnerable states, the staffing should really be hiked up in November. And then the easing for the medium and low need should be in February, and then April for the high need. So really we should be focusing on the high need, the highly vulnerable states, and also the states with the high influenza death rate. And so that concludes my project for today. I appreciate your time, and thank you very much. Stay healthy.